Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight's journey doesn't involve beheadings, battlefield amputations, or the kind of plague that makes your toes fall off. No, tonight we're exploring something far more uncomfortable. Romance, or at least the medieval version of it. This is the story of how people in scratchy wool and questionable shoes tried, with mixed results, to flirt. We'll wander from manure-covered fields to dim cathedral corners, from ale-stained market stalls to love poems so overwrought they could be classified as heresy. Because before anyone could fall in love, they first had to survive the mortifying ordeal of trying to seem desirable, without soap or privacy. Before we begin this slow, awkward unravelling of history's worst courtship rituals, do me one small favour. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always oddly comforting to see how far this little lantern of strange history travels. If you prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you listen to these in bed, consider using a pair of wireless sleep earbuds for enhanced immersion. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed for side sleepers. I've linked my favourite pair in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. If you were a medieval peasant, your options for flirtation were limited. Not in the sense of romantic scarcity, though that was a factor, but in terms of time, privacy, and acceptable behaviour. You had no drawing room, no dance card, and certainly no secluded gardens in which to stroll under moonlight. What you had, more often than not, was a field, a bucket, and a long list of chores. Romance, if it happened at all, had to squeeze itself into the spaces between labour and surveillance. And those spaces were narrow. Marriage among the lower classes was not necessarily arranged. But that didn't make it romantic. The freedom to choose one's spouse was a freedom exercised under pressure. You chose from those nearby, those available, and those not already sworn to someone else, by contract or by pregnancy. In a village of perhaps a few dozen families, your romantic prospects might include the girl who throws dung over your fence, the boy who smells permanently of onions, and your second cousin, who technically isn't off limits but still feels like a mistake. It wasn't so much courtship as controlled exposure. Flirtation, if you could call it that, had to work within the rhythms of communal life. A smile exchanged during communal baking, a few extra beans slipped into someone's ration, a sudden offer to help carry water or chop wood. These were gestures of interest, often noticed, always noted. Everyone saw everything. The church saw it, the reeve saw it, your aunt, 2 neighbours, and the midwife saw it. This was not a world of secret love affairs. It was a world where sharing a bench could result in gossip and accusations of sin. Peasant flirtation also operated through gifts, though the term gift should be understood loosely. A good courting present might include a slightly bruised apple, a recently skinned rabbit, or a length of twine. A particularly bold admirer might offer the foot of a pheasant, still warm, with feathers intact. If the object of your affection was impressed, they might nod. If they were unimpressed, they might laugh. Or worse, accept it anyway and marry someone else. Symbolism was murky. A slice of bread could mean affection, hunger, or pity, or all three. Labour itself became a kind of language. If someone helped you thresh your grain or repair your fence without being asked, they might be flirting, or they might be angling for a share of your winter stores. The two were not mutually exclusive. In a world of scarce resources and physical strain, acts of assistance often doubled as acts of courtship. You didn't just marry for love, you married for additional hands. A flirtation might begin with a dead pheasant and end in a communal mud pit wedding, but in between was a negotiation of survival. Public festivals occasionally offered some relief from constant scrutiny, but not much. Dancing, drinking, and May Day rituals allowed for a bit more openness. But even then, every interaction came with consequences. If you danced with the same person twice, someone's mother might start inquiring about banns. If you were caught kissing behind a hay cart, it could result in public penance, enforced betrothal, or a hurried ceremony conducted by a priest who hadn't even finished his beer. The church played an ever-watchful role. Priests didn't just oversee sacraments, they observed behaviour, recorded banns, and delivered sermons with unnervingly specific warnings. Lust was a frequent topic. So was chastity. A priest might condemn fornication from the pulpit on Sunday, then quietly bless a marriage born out of a suspicious pregnancy the following Friday. The goal was not consistency, but containment. Flirtation was acceptable only when it led efficiently towards sanctioned marriage. Anything more imaginative was dangerous. Gender expectations shaped the terms of courtship. For young men, flirtation was expected to be clumsy but persistent. A farmhand might call out compliments from across a pen, or sling a frog at the girl he fancied. For young women, responses were coded and cautious. A returned smile could lead to rumours. A refusal might lead to retaliation. There was no script, only the constant need to navigate attention without inviting punishment. Daughters were warned to guard their modesty. Sons were advised to get on with it. The resulting dynamic was, unsurprisingly, a mess. There was no such thing as privacy. Peasant homes were small, crowded, and shared with livestock. If you wanted a moment alone with someone, you had to be creative and fast. A few exchanged words behind the pigsty, a minute at the communal well, a brief walk to gather herbs, always chaperoned by a child or an elderly relative pretending not to hear. Entire romances unfolded through half-sentences, past glances, and shared chores. The idea of a candlelit dinner would have seemed both decadent and logistically baffling. And yet, emotion persisted. People still fell in love, or what passed for love in a world of obligation and fatigue. They blushed. They stumbled over greetings. They carved crude symbols into tree trunks. They composed rhymes that didn't scan and told jokes that made no sense. They found beauty in someone's hands or someone's voice, or the way they carried a bucket. Attraction had to live in small things, because large things, time, space, intention, were luxuries. The stakes were high. A single misstep could damage a reputation permanently. A girl seen walking too late with a boy might find herself shunned. A boy caught boasting about conquests could be flogged or conscripted. The rules were strict, the punishments severe, and the line between teasing and transgression was invisible until crossed. Gossip, not law, was often the real enforcer. If the village believed you had done something improper, then you had, regardless of facts. Age was a factor too. Girls were considered marriageable from their early teens. Boys typically several years later, once they could support a household. This meant that flirtation often began before emotional maturity, and sometimes before full comprehension. The result was a culture of mimicry, where younger villagers repeated the patterns they had seen, offering tokens, reciting fragments of overheard songs, mimicking gestures with no real understanding of what they meant. Courtship became ritual, not romance. When flirtation failed or succeeded inappropriately, the community stepped in. Forced marriages were not uncommon. Neither were public penances, shame parades, or the deeply medieval solution of simply pretending nothing had happened. If a pregnancy resulted from an unsanctioned tryst, the options were grim. Marry quickly, confess publicly, or disappear temporarily and return with a story involving a cousin's baby. Entire social structures existed to absorb the consequences of rural flirtation gone wrong. Despite everything, surveillance, shame, the ever-present smell of goats, there was humour. Villages told stories about disastrous courtships and awkward suitors. Songs were sung about failed attempts and improbable successes. If someone wooed their future spouse by falling face first into a puddle while carrying firewood, that story might be told for years. Laughter softened the awkwardness, at least until someone got excommunicated. Language played a role, though it was rarely poetic. Compliments tended toward the literal. You have strong teeth, you milk quickly, or you don't cough as much as the others. Sincerity mattered more than lyricism, mostly because metaphor was prone to misfire. Comparing someone's eyes to wet gooseberries might seem romantic in theory, but in practice, it left room for interpretation. Regional dialects, poor literacy, and a general lack of practice made verbal flirtation something of a minefield. In some regions, courtship customs emerged to formalise the awkwardness. Bundling, for example, allowed potential couples to lie beside each other in bed, fully clothed, sometimes sewn into sacks, to talk through the night under supervision, ostensibly a way to foster emotional intimacy. It was also an exercise in restraint, community expectation, and blanket logistics. Other customs involved symbolic gestures, such as presenting a lock of hair or weaving initials into a sleeve. These rituals added a layer of formality, but didn't reduce the risk of misunderstanding. Economic concerns loomed large. A prospective match was assessed not just for charm, but for assets. Did he have land? A cow? Enough tools? Could she spin, brew, and survive childbirth? Flirtation was never detached from function. A charming suitor with no prospects was a liability. A plain one with a pig was worth a second glance. Romantic preference existed, but it bent easily under the weight of necessity. And yet, amid all the calculation, something like affection could bloom. A couple might come to know each other over months of shared labour, harvests, repairs, firewood collection. A partnership could begin with mutual exhaustion, deepened by proximity, and eventually soften into care. Love, when it happened, was earned slowly, through effort and accident. It might not look like a storybook, but it endured longer than many ballads. When a match was agreed upon, formally or informally, it was often celebrated with communal approval. The village might gossip less. The priest might nod in resigned approval. Parents might offer a blessing, a chicken, or a suspiciously worded piece of advice. Weddings followed swiftly. There was little room for prolonged engagement. If the couple was already living together unofficially, a ceremony might serve more as social confirmation than a beginning. Some couples stayed together for life, others drifted apart emotionally, while remaining bound legally and economically. There was no legal divorce, only separation or toleration. But among the peasants, tolerance was often the closest thing to romance. A husband who didn't complain too loudly, a wife who shared her bread, a mutual agreement to ignore each other after sundown. In its own way, it worked. Peasant flirtation was rarely about self-expression. It was about timing, reputation, and survival. But within those constraints, real feelings emerged. People found ways to communicate affection through small gestures, shared burdens, and the occasional accidental poetry of awkward timing. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't private, but it was, in the end, recognisably human. Not all stories ended well. Some ended in scandal, some in silence, some in marriage so unsatisfying that even the cows seemed embarrassed. But occasionally, two people in rough-spun linen managed to find a kind of affection, a rhythm, a way of being slightly less miserable together. And in a world where everything was difficult, that was more than enough. While peasant flirtation was defined by mud, obligation, and the ever-present gaze of the entire village, the world of tradesfolk and artisans offered marginally more freedom, and a different set of social complications. If you were a shoemaker's apprentice, a market day baker, or a tanner with a steady hand and a questionable smell, your romantic gestures had to compete with the constant hum of work. You didn't have time for poetry, but you might manage a well-shaped button, a fresh pastry, or a carved token left behind on a stall. Courtship in the artisan class was folded directly into labour. You met your potential partners at the market, in the shop, or during deliveries. There were no ballroom dances, but there were long mornings of hauling sacks together, afternoons of shared tasks, and evenings spent cleaning up after customers who paid late and haggled loudly. If you liked someone, you helped them lift something. If you liked them a great deal, you gave them something handmade. Unfortunately, in a commercial setting, this often caused confusion. If you handed a barmaid a carved spoon, she might assume it was a proposal, or a bribe, or a review of her table service. All three were plausible. Artisan flirting operated under the same pressure as the rest of medieval life. Function first? Romance was not impractical, but it was expected to serve a purpose. The woman you courted might one day manage your shop while you were away. The man you noticed across the bakery might be useful in mending your oven. A marriage wasn't just emotional, it was logistical. It joined not only bodies and reputations, but tools, skills and debts. To flirt was, in a very real sense, to audition for long-term mutual labour. Apprenticeship played a peculiar role in all this. Young men, and occasionally young women, entered trades in their teens, living under the roof of a master craftsman for 7 years or more. This meant working long hours, obeying rules, and spending one's formative years surrounded by sharp tools, temperamental adults, and the master's daughter. That last part introduced a minefield of romantic peril. To show interest in the daughter of your employer could lead to marriage, disgrace, or a sudden relocation to another town with fewer teeth. For those who ran their own shops or stalls, flirtation could be masked as customer service. A baker might press a slightly larger loaf into a preferred customer's hand. A candle maker might deliver an order in person, claiming the need to ensure the wick was right. A cooper might offer to repair a barrel for free, then spend the next week inventing reasons to come by and check it. It was an awkward dance of commercial pretext and personal interest, and it was made more awkward by the fact that everyone else noticed. Markets were especially fertile ground for this kind of exchange. In the bustling streets of a market town, you could buy turnips, sell buttons, and attempt to propose marriage through the medium of finely stitched gloves. The anonymity of the crowd offered a little cover, especially in larger towns, but even then, vendors had reputations. If the fishmonger started offering extra fillets to a particular customer, the gossip began before the scales dried. Sometimes that was the point. A public courtship, properly performed, could attract the approval of onlookers, or, if it went poorly, the ridicule of everyone within earshot. Gifts were common but deeply coded. A small coin-shaped token with initials carved into it might symbolise romantic intent. A ribbon, a decorated buckle, or even a painted wooden button might serve the same purpose. These tokens, if accepted, could be worn in public to signify reciprocal affection. If rejected, they were quietly returned or publicly discarded, depending on the mood of the recipient. This made gift-giving both risky and expensive. There was nothing quite like spending 3 days carving a perfectly smooth comb, only to watch it handed off to someone else's cousin, with a muttered, "It looked itchy." Letters, while more common among the literate elite, did appear in the artisan class, particularly in towns. Literacy was uneven but growing, and a few well-chosen words could carry more weight than a dozen carrots. Unfortunately, not all writers were poets, and not all readers were patient. A letter filled with sentimental lines might be treasured or mocked, depending on the clarity of the ink, the quality of the grammar, and the reputation of the sender. Love notes passed between market stalls often suffered from damp weather, chicken droppings, and uninvited readers. Discretion was rarely on offer. Gender norms shaped these exchanges with predictable asymmetry. Men were expected to initiate, to offer, to pursue. Women were expected to respond, to deflect, or to appear entirely disinterested until the paperwork was signed. Yet within the constraints, subtle tactics emerged. A young woman might rearrange the vegetables on her stall to bring herself into closer contact with a certain vendor. A seamstress might delay a customer's pickup just long enough to force another interaction. A shared glance during church or a slightly prolonged handshake could carry meaning far beyond its surface. It was a language built on minor acts and plausible deniability. Still, misunderstanding was the default state. Was that extra pastry a sign of affection or a mistake in counting? Was the bootmaker smiling because he liked you, or because your shoelaces were different lengths and he couldn't stop staring at them? In a world where flirting and business coexisted uncomfortably, intentions were always in question. There was no reliable guidebook, only inference and repetition. Some people got it wrong for years. Guilds, when they existed, added another layer of complexity. Within certain trades, members belonged to structured associations that governed everything from pricing to conduct. Flirting within the guild, especially between apprentices and masters' family members, was strongly discouraged, unless it resulted in marriage. Then it was retroactively approved. In cities like London or Bruges, guild regulations sometimes even touched on family reputation, ensuring that romantic entanglements didn't disrupt professional hierarchies. Of course, enforcing such boundaries was difficult when half the city had already heard about the cooper's nephew and the blacksmith's niece. Workshops also functioned as stages for silent intimacy. Two people sanding wood together might not speak for hours, yet grow familiar through motion and habit. There was something inherently vulnerable about working in proximity, sweating, focusing, occasionally cursing at tools, and in that vulnerability, something like fondness could grow. A shared joke, a loaned tool, a bandaged finger. These were the moments where flirtation flickered. No declarations, just presence. And yet, it was hard to be subtle in a room full of hammers. Many workshops were small, crowded, and noisy. Privacy was rare. You might want to compliment someone's stitching or the way they handled a chisel, but your remarks would be immediately heard by 3 apprentices and an elderly journeyman with nothing better to do than comment on your technique. Both in woodworking and romance, mockery was inevitable. Sometimes good-natured, sometimes not. Public festivals offered some escape. Feast days, saints' days, and local fairs provided cover for behaviour that might otherwise be questioned. A man might offer a flower rather than a discount. A woman might braid her hair in a particular style to catch someone's attention. During dances and processions, hands touched more freely. Compliments were offered more openly. Masks and ales smoothed the sharp edges of social protocol. Of course, the consequences still followed. A flirtation that went too far might result in whispers, reputational damage, or an awkward conversation with someone's uncle holding a ledger. Still, risk was part of the process. Few artisans had the luxury of marrying entirely for love. but most hoped for at least a sliver of mutual enjoyment. A partner who was kind, who laughed at your jokes, who understood why the dye in your hands never quite washed off. Courtship was an attempt to find not only companionship, but cooperation. Someone who would hold the ladder, stir the vat, handle the customers you hated. It was as much about shared burdens as it was about stolen glances. When two tradespeople married, it was often as a merger. She brought her weaving skills. He brought his leather tools. Together, they expanded a stall, built a name, and, ideally, produced children to help run it. Love might or might not be involved, but affection could grow from routine. There was dignity in daily effort, and sometimes that translated into warmth. A husband who kept your needle sharp, a wife who knew when to lie to a supplier. These were small, potent kinds of intimacy. Some romances failed, of course. Tokens were rejected, affection shifted, gossip curdled. A flirtation that had once been charming might sour with unmet expectations or badly timed jokes. Arguments broke out in public. Shop signs were changed. Sometimes, a former suitor found themselves banned from a particular stall for reasons that were both unspoken and widely understood. And occasionally, a courtship gone wrong ended with someone moving towns altogether. Reputation once frayed was difficult to repair, but not all failures were disasters. In many cases, rejection was absorbed into the rhythm of daily life. You nodded, you moved on, you carved a new spoon and handed it to someone else. Artisans understood the value of trying again, shaping, mending, starting fresh. Romance, like craft, involved repetition. Flirtation among tradespeople was quieter than poetry, messier than legend, and more enduring than rumour. It hid in workrooms, echoed in marketplaces, and clung to hand-stitched garments like chalk dust. It wasn't always noticed, it wasn't always successful, but it was, in its own way, honest. Not every spoon carved was accepted, not every token returned, but sometimes, in the clatter of tools and the rhythm of routine, someone noticed, someone smiled, someone lingered a moment longer by the dye vat or walked a little slower past the stall. Among peasants and artisans, flirtation had to be practical. It was hidden in chores, embedded in trade, and shaped by the realities of survival. But in the rarefied world of nobility, where wealth and distance from the plough allowed for more elaborate expressions, courtship became something else entirely. It became a performance, a theatrical, overwrought, and often deeply impractical ritual in which longing was the main ingredient and physical contact was conspicuously absent. If you were a nobleman in love, the correct move was to stare longingly from behind a hedge while writing sonnets about her elbows. Courtly love, as it came to be known, was not about mutual affection or even plausible partnership. It was about demonstrating refined suffering. A knight might spend years sighing over a lady he was never allowed to touch, let alone speak to. A noblewoman might accept his tokens, read his poetry, and acknowledge his devotion with a vague nod at mass, before marrying someone else entirely for political reasons. The point was not consummation. The point was torment. That was how you knew it was real. The origins of this tradition can be traced to the courts of 12th century southern France, where troubadours composed elaborate verses in Occitan about unattainable women and the exquisite agony of unfulfilled desire. The idea spread quickly, particularly among young men with too much time and not enough battles to fight. Soon the courts of Europe were full of pale aristocrats composing stanzas on the virtues of distant women they had maybe glimpsed once during a falconry demonstration. These poems were full of metaphor, none of it helpful. A lady's beauty might be compared to a rose, a star, or the Virgin Mary, all in the same verse. Her hair might be described as sunlit silk, her breath as divine mist, and her ankles as heaven's threshold. What any of that meant in practical terms was unclear, but clarity was never the goal. Obscurity was proof of sincerity. If you could be both confusing and pathetic in the same sentence, you were doing it correctly. The rules of courtly love were extensive. You were not supposed to pursue someone who was already available. That would be too easy and therefore meaningless. True devotion required obstacles, preferably social, spiritual, or geographical. Ideally, the object of your affection was already married, or about to be, or entirely uninterested. This created the necessary conditions for yearning, which was the emotional currency of the system. The longer you pined, the purer your love was considered to be. Men performed chivalric deeds to prove their devotion. This could include fighting in tournaments, winning symbolic tokens, or going off to war while loudly declaring that every wound would be for her. Sometimes they literally wore a lady's token, often a glove, a sleeve, or a piece of ribbon, during combat. The more visible your suffering, the more noble your affection appeared. If you happened to get trampled by a horse while clutching her kerchief, all the better. That was commitment. Women were expected to be gracious, elusive, and impossibly composed. Their job was not to reciprocate, but to inspire. They read letters, sometimes responded, and frequently pretended not to notice the dramatic gestures being made on their behalf. A lady walking through a hall might pass a man prostrate on the floor, claiming he could not rise until she acknowledged his loyalty. She was meant to keep walking. That was considered dignified. Of course, not all noble flirtation followed the rules. Some couples did fall in love. Some letters led to meetings. Some glances led to touches, and some touches to scandal. But these were the exceptions rather than the model. In theory, the more impossible the romance, the more admirable it became. This had the convenient effect of allowing noble households to preserve alliances through arranged marriages while still enjoying the theatre of emotional rebellion, provided that rebellion remained entirely symbolic. Writing was central to noble flirtation. Letters were exchanged through intermediaries, ladies in waiting, trusted servants, or occasionally monks with loose ethics. These letters were often filled with tortured declarations, references to obscure mythology, and grammar so mangled that even experienced scribes struggled to decipher it. A single paragraph might include 3 different spellings of devotion, several contradictions, and an invocation of Jupiter. The recipient, if literate, was expected to respond with something equally florid, or at the very least to store the letter in a scented box as proof of their spiritual appeal. Libraries of such correspondence survive, and reading them now can feel like deciphering the diary of someone with both a head injury and a thesaurus. One knight wrote to his beloved that her eyes had pierced his soul with heavenly daggers, and that he hoped to die in battle, so that her name might be carved into his ribcage by angels. She responded politely that she was flattered, but reminded him that her husband was watching. Tournaments provided a more physical outlet. These elaborate mock battles were opportunities for knights to show off strength, bravery, and the ability to be hit with a lance without crying. Victors often dedicated their performance to a lady, sometimes presenting her with a bloody token as proof of their devotion. This might include a shattered spear, a piece of armour, or a poem hastily scrawled on the back of a wounded squire. It was considered very romantic. Feasts and formal gatherings offered further opportunity for symbolic flirtation. Dancing was structured and heavily supervised. Conversation was coded and fleeting. A glance across the hall might be noted, by 20 other people, all of whom would begin constructing a narrative before dessert. If a man offered a woman a seat, a plate, or a plum, he was declaring something, though what exactly was often unclear. Interpretation was everything, and everyone interpreted differently. Fashion too played a role. Noblemen wore bright colours, embroidered sleeves, and hats large enough to obstruct doorways. Noble women wore tightly laced gowns, heavily adorned headpieces, and jewellery with secret compartments for perfumed cloth or tiny notes. A particular arrangement of ribbons could indicate romantic interest. The choice of colour in a tunic might signal recent heartbreak. Entire conversations took place without a single word exchanged, though this only worked if both parties had memorised the same codebook. Chastity was praised loudly, especially for women, but rarely practised with equal fervour. A lady might be married off to a man twice her age, but still find herself the subject of poems by 4 different suitors, 2 of whom were cousins. Navigating this attention required skill. A misstep could result in social ruin, while an artful deflection might earn praise for modest wit. The goal was to be desirable, but untouchable, adored but unavailable. It was a difficult balancing act, especially when actual emotions became involved. Of course, not everyone had the patience for this system. Some noble women, weary of metaphors and melancholy, cut through the performance with quiet disdain. There are records of ladies responding to love poems with polite sarcasm, or correcting the grammar before returning the letter. One woman famously replied to a knight's declaration of eternal loyalty with the words, "Then be loyal over there." She later married a merchant and was, by all accounts, quite happy. In other cases, the entire court became part of the flirtation. Public readings of poetry, dramatic sighs in corridors, musical serenades beneath high windows, all were tolerated, even encouraged, provided they didn't disrupt alliances or risk reputations. There was something flattering about being the object of such visible devotion, even if the feelings behind it were vague. Being admired made you important. Being longed for made you poetic. Being available, unfortunately, made you dull. For noblemen, the danger lay in taking things too far. A poorly timed advance could result in exile, disgrace, or forced marriage to a woman who had no interest in metaphor. For noble women, the danger was greater. Even the hint of impropriety could end a social career, reduce a dowry, or invite ecclesiastical inquiry. Maintaining the illusion of flirtation without inviting consequence was an art form, and those who mastered it could wield remarkable power, at least until their father married them off to a man who smelled like boiled meat. Religion, naturally, loomed in the background. Monks disapproved, priests warned, sermons were delivered about the dangers of lust, especially poetic lust, which was considered particularly insidious because it sounded virtuous while leading straight to damnation. Love letters were sometimes burned, confessions were made, penances were assigned that included fasting, prayer, and the immediate cessation of metaphor. None of it worked. The sonnets continued. In many ways, courtly love was not about romance at all. It was about performance. It gave people something to do between wars, something to discuss during embroidery, and something to recite after wine. It allowed for the expression of feeling in a world where feelings were often subordinated to duty. It gave longing a script, even if the actors were unconvincing. Not every noble flirtation ended in heartbreak. Some ended in quiet marriages, long letters, and mutual tolerance. A few even grew into affection, but most ended where they began, in sighs, in songs, in glances across banquet halls where everyone was pretending not to notice. If you were a nobleman in love, you didn't act, you waited, You watched, you wrote something confusing, and then you jousted until you passed out. For the nobility, romance was a carefully scripted performance, a display of longing, symbolism, and strategic restraint. But what of those who weren't supposed to flirt at all? Those who had taken vows of chastity, cloistered themselves away from the world, and promised to turn their affections entirely toward God? Surely, in monasteries and convents, the heart remained still, and the body obedient. Not quite. Even in these most sacred of spaces, desire found a way in. Sometimes through a hymn, sometimes through a whispered confession, and sometimes through an imprudently long glance, at exactly the wrong moment, because no matter how high the walls or how strict the rule, human beings are rarely as disciplined as the architecture around them would suggest. For monks and nuns, flirtation was not simply frowned upon, it was forbidden. More than that, it was feared. To experience romantic or sexual desire was not only a personal weakness, it was a potential rupture in the entire spiritual order. This was a world built on obedience, denial, and the belief that the flesh was a troublesome, leaky vessel best managed by rigorous schedules and uncomfortable furniture. A monk's time was divided into prayer, labour, meals, and sleep, all strictly regulated and deliberately monotonous. There was no room in theory for wandering eyes. In practice, however, repression does not equal elimination. The human mind is highly creative when denied outlets. And so, beneath the silence of the cloister, small dramas unfolded. A monk might find himself repeatedly volunteering for the same work detail as Brother Thomas. A nun might pray a little longer than necessary beside Sister Magdalene, carefully not looking directly at her, but memorizing the curve of her hands as she turned the pages of a psalter. Nothing was said, of course. It rarely was. That was part of the torment. The earlier stages of these quiet affections were often ambiguous, even to those experiencing them. Was this admiration or temptation? Was this feeling a test from God or a personal failing? The line between spiritual devotion and human affection blurred easily, especially when the only people you saw daily were dressed identically and quoted scripture at breakfast. The result was a kind of romantic fog, an emotional landscape made of confusion, fear, and the occasional overwhelming desire to trip over someone in the garden path purely by accident. If you made eye contact too long during Vespers, congratulations! That was now a mortal sin, or at the very least, the subject of intense internal examination. Monastic rules were designed to avoid temptation entirely. Men and women were separated by walls, gates, and in some cases literal moats. Communication between monasteries and convents was strictly monitored. Letters, if exchanged at all, were reviewed by superiors and often censored for suspicious phrasing. A nun who referred to a monk as particularly insightful might be questioned. A monk who complimented a nun's Latin handwriting might find himself reassigned to vegetable duty for several months, and yet communication happened, sometimes through legitimate means, shared religious texts, spiritual discussions, choral collaborations, and sometimes through decidedly less sanctioned channels. There are records of messages smuggled between monastic communities, hidden in bread loaves, sewn into cassocks, or scribbled in the margins of theological treatises. One monk reportedly carved a message into the base of a candle intended for a convent, and then prayed it wouldn't melt before arrival. He later transferred to a hermitage, voluntarily. Music was a particular danger. When monks and nuns sang together during joint feast days or special services, the experience could be unintentionally stirring. Harmony, after all, is an intimate thing. The shared breath, the rise and fall of voices, the sustained eye contact across a chapel. All these could spark feelings that no amount of incense could quite smother. Choirs were sometimes separated by wooden screens, not for acoustics, but to prevent inappropriate resonance. Even within single-sex communities, affection could bloom. Monasteries and convents were not sterile environments. They were deeply human institutions filled with loneliness, discipline, and longing. Friendships could become entangled with attraction, a shared towel, a quiet laugh, a moment of physical contact while assisting with an injury. These were tiny events, easily explained, easily dismissed, but they echoed through the silence louder than any bell. The rule of St. Benedict, the gold standard of monastic regulation in the West, was quite clear on the matter. Obedience, chastity, and stability were the pillars of the life. Anything that disrupted the soul's singular focus on God was to be avoided. And so monks and nuns trained themselves to look down, speak little, and suppress anything that might resemble affection. But suppression is not the same as resolution. An internal discipline often manifested in curious ways. Extended fasts, ritual self-denial, or suddenly developing a passionate attachment to manuscript copying as a means of distraction. Some monastics wrote about their struggles with striking honesty. The 12th century abbot Aelred of Rievaulx, for example, wrote extensively on spiritual friendship, occasionally blurring the line between Platonic and devotional language. Hildegard of Bingen described visions filled with intense emotional imagery and ecstatic union with the divine, which some modern readers interpret as an expression of sublimated desire. These weren't declarations of forbidden love, but they were windows into the emotional complexity of cloistered life, the way that longing could be recast but not extinguished. Of course, not everyone succeeded in keeping their vows. Scandals did happen. There are records of monks sneaking out at night to visit local women, of nuns becoming pregnant and blaming visions, and of entire monastic communities being reprimanded for excessive familiarity. Punishments ranged from increased fasting to forced relocation, and in extreme cases, public confession and expulsion. But more often than not, these situations were handled quietly, with the goal of preserving the community's reputation rather than punishing individuals harshly. One infamous example comes from 14th century France, where a particularly persuasive monk managed to infiltrate a nearby convent by disguising himself as a visiting cleric. Over the course of several months, he engaged in secret liaisons with two nuns, leaving behind a trail of cryptic letters, misfiled psalms, and at least one suspiciously annotated hymnal. When discovered, he fled. The nuns were punished with solitary confinement and extra prayers. The monk was never found, though a later record notes a Brother Guillaume living suspiciously well in a different region. These stories were not the norm, but they were not rare either. Desire, especially when forbidden, has a way of shaping behaviour in unexpected directions. For many monks and nuns, the crisis was internal, a constant process of noticing, resisting, and repenting. The confessional became both a relief and a trap, a place where feelings were acknowledged but not resolved. I thought of her was enough to trigger a week of self-denial. I touched her hand might lead to penance and reassignment. For those who managed to navigate their feelings with care, there was a kind of quiet nobility in restraint. Affection could be sublimated into spiritual practice. Attraction could be acknowledged as a form of temptation and then offered up as a sacrifice. The process wasn't always clean and certainly not painless, but it allowed some to live with their emotions rather than be destroyed by them. It was not so much the absence of desire that defined a successful monastic life, but the willingness to confront it without flinching. Sometimes a monk or nun would form a lifelong attachment, a deep platonic bond that offered comfort without crossing lines. These relationships could be rich and sustaining, a reminder that love in its many forms did not have to be romantic or sexual to be meaningful. In a life defined by discipline, such companionships could become lifelines. They were rarely spoken of in public, but they left marks in shared letters, in careful records, in mutual prayers that spanned decades. None of this undermines the sincerity of the monastic ideal. Many monks and nuns lived lives of extraordinary devotion, discipline, and spiritual insight, but their humanity persisted, stubborn and uncooperative. Flirtation in the cloister may have been rare, subtle, and heavily suppressed, but it was never fully eliminated. It slipped between the cracks, in songs, in glances, in scribbled notes, and in dreams that left one waking with a sense of guilt and something else they couldn't quite name. This was a world where even eye contact could be dangerous, where the smallest gesture carried moral weight, and where the language of affection had to be hidden beneath layers of spiritual metaphor. And yet, in some quiet way, that made every act of feeling, however fleeting, resonate more deeply. In monasteries and convents, the rules were clear: no touching, no eye contact, and absolutely no gestures that might resemble longing. But outside those high walls, down in the villages, across the hills, and tucked behind smoke-stained cottages, the rules blurred. Where theology loosened its grip, something older and far less structured took its place. Folk traditions, whispered remedies, and half-remembered rituals filled the gap between desire and its consequences. If you couldn't flirt publicly, you might try to enchant someone privately. If your glance went unnoticed, perhaps your bread wouldn't be. This was a world where attraction could be cultivated like a herb, bottled like wine, or baked directly into a meat pie. It was a form of flirting that had little to do with words and everything to do with intention. You didn't need to recite poetry when you had wormwood, powdered bone, and a grandmother with very firm beliefs about rosemary. Love in this context was less an emotion and more a recipe, and while the results were inconsistent, the effort was sincere. Witchcraft, of course, is a loaded term, especially in a medieval context. Many of the women labelled as witches were nothing of the sort. They were herbalists, midwives, widows, or simply people with too many cats and not enough respect for clerical authority. But in the realm of romantic manipulation, these so-called witches became the custodians of a peculiar tradition. The belief that love could be summoned, controlled, or chemically induced. The church frowned. The villagers paid in eggs. One of the most common tools in this pursuit was the love charm. These ranged from simple amulets to elaborate rituals involving bodily fluids, spoken incantations, and offerings buried at crossroads. A young woman might wear a pouch of dried flowers and animal teeth to attract a suitor. A shepherd might sleep with a carved talisman under his pillow in hopes of dream visitations from his future wife. The logic was rarely explained in full, but it didn't need to be. If someone said it worked and you were desperate enough, that was all the proof required. Potions were the more advanced option and considerably riskier. Recipes varied wildly depending on region, season, and the temperament of the local wise woman. Some called for rose hips, cinnamon, and honey. Others involved menstrual blood, crushed beetles, and just a dash of grave dirt. The line between aphrodisiac and poisoning was worryingly thin. A draught meant to spark infatuation might instead cause vomiting, hallucinations, or a brief but memorable coma. Still, the desire to be loved, or at least noticed, was strong enough that many were willing to gamble. These love potions were not administered openly. They were slipped into ale, stirred into stews, or painted discreetly onto clothing. The recipient was never told. That was part of the magic. Love had to arrive mysteriously, unprovoked, as though fate had taken a personal interest. If someone offered you a heart-shaped cake, made of sheep's blood and rosemary, the correct response was not to ask questions. It was to pretend it was normal and hope for the best. Sometimes the goal wasn't to attract but to bind. Binding spells promised not just affection, but control. These were rituals intended to keep someone faithful, to prevent wandering eyes or wandering feet. A woman might hide a nail wrapped in hair beneath the threshold of her lover's home. A man might burn a piece of cloth taken from his partner's tunic while chanting a phrase learned from his grandmother, who claimed to have used the same method on a knight who later died peacefully in her bed. Whether these spells worked was beside the point. The illusion of influence was its own comfort. Even fertility was dragged into the mix. In rural communities, a woman's desirability was linked closely to her ability to produce children. As a result, charms meant to enhance fertility often doubled as romantic tools. A woman might bathe in herbs, wear a necklace of dried fruit pits, or consume a special broth designed to open the womb, and by implication, the heart. Men too had their versions, though these typically involved garlic, wine, and a level of optimism unsupported by any actual outcome. None of this existed in a vacuum. The church, ever suspicious of anything that smacked of folk practice, condemned love magic as heretical, sinful, and likely to lead to eternal damnation. Sermons warned against it. Confessionals buzzed with it. Ecclesiastical courts occasionally prosecuted it, especially if someone got sick, married poorly, or died mysteriously after a particularly enthusiastic spoonful of enchanted porridge. But enforcement was inconsistent. Most clergy knew better than to challenge a widow with 8 grandchildren and a robust knowledge of hedgerow botanicals. Community perception, however, was another matter. If a woman was known to use charms, she was eyed with both admiration and suspicion. Some believed she had special powers. Others believed she was meddling with dangerous forces. If she remained unmarried too long, she might be called unnatural. If she attracted too many suitors, she might be accused of manipulation. If one of those suitors turned out to be someone else's intended, she might find herself tried for witchcraft. Love, it seemed, had legal consequences. And yet, many of these practices were handed down like heirlooms. Mothers taught daughters, midwives whispered recipes, peddlers sold small vials, labelled only with symbols and promises. In a world where women often had little control over their marriages, their reputations, or their social standing, love magic offered the illusion of agency. If you couldn't choose who noticed you, perhaps you could nudge fate in your favour, or at least prevent your betrothed from running off with someone who made better biscuits. Men too indulged in magical thinking. Though less likely to be accused of witchcraft, they were not above consulting wise women for advice, buying charms, or secretly anointing their hats with oils, said to provoke admiration. In some regions, young men would bury a copper coin soaked in milk beneath their beds to attract a blushing bride. What the milk had to do with it remains unclear, but the confidence it inspired was apparently enough to justify the smell. Animals sometimes featured in these rituals, usually unwillingly. A black cat's hair might be added to a potion. A rooster's crow might be used to time an incantation. In particularly rural areas, a toad dried in the sun and stuffed with herbs was believed to make an effective talisman for lust, though few were willing to carry it in public. These ingredients weren't chosen for charm. They were chosen because they felt ancient, forbidden, and powerful, qualities often confused with effectiveness. Not every attempt was subtle. Some practitioners made their intent known. A woman might present a man with a charm openly, declaring it a gift of luck. A man might offer a tincture and claim it would make her dream sweeter. Whether the recipients believed the contents mattered less than whether they believed the giver meant well. Like all flirting, magical or not, the effect was often secondary to the gesture. Of course, many love charms did nothing. Most potions were ineffective. Many amulets were just bits of string and wishful thinking. But they offered hope. They gave people something to do in the face of loneliness, rejection, or the simple frustration of waiting to be noticed. They were a form of emotional craft, equal parts performance, tradition, and placebo. And sometimes, just sometimes, they worked. Whether because of the herbs or the timing or simple coincidence, someone smiled, someone lingered, someone said yes. And when they didn't work, there was always blame to assign. The wrong moon phase, the wrong ingredients, the meddling presence of a rival with stronger charms. Disappointment could be rationalized as spiritual interference or magical imbalance. Rarely was it considered that perhaps the object of one's affection simply didn't like goat's blood pudding. Still, belief in these practices endured. Well into the late medieval period, love magic remained a quietly accepted undercurrent of rural life. It was part of the cultural fabric, unofficial, unsanctioned, but deeply familiar. Even those who laughed at it often knew someone who swore by it. It gave shape to the inexpressible, turning the awkward, aching business of attraction into something you could mix, measure, or carry in your pocket. For those excluded from traditional courtship, widows, the poor, the physically disabled, the socially marginalized, these rituals could also be an act of defiance. If society wouldn't offer you romance, you might try to summon it yourself. You might gather herbs by moonlight, whisper a spell learned from your grandmother, and hope that something beyond custom and class might intervene. Flirtation, in this form, was less about clever words or well-timed glances. It was about intention, about will, about the quiet belief that love, like crops and weather, could be coaxed into cooperation. It was a hopeful, sometimes ridiculous, sometimes dangerous practice, but it was also deeply human. Because even if the potion didn't work, even if the charm went unnoticed, and even if the sheep's blood cake ended up in the compost, at least you'd tried. And in a world where so many had no choice at all, trying was its own kind of power. For most of the year, medieval flirtation was bound by rules, reputation, and the exhausting logistics of survival. But there were moments, brief, chaotic, and heavily scented with ale, when the social order loosened just enough to allow something else, something louder, something riskier, something that, under normal circumstances, would have resulted in a stern sermon, and possibly a marriage. These were the festivals and feast days, structured celebrations where rules were temporarily relaxed, costumes were encouraged, and the normal boundaries of behaviour could be danced around, sometimes literally. If folk magic was about control, about manipulating love through secret charms and whispered spells, festivals were about letting go. For a few designated days each year, the entire village was invited to misbehave just slightly more than usual. The church ever pragmatic sanctioned these occasions with a kind of exhausted tolerance, better perhaps to contain chaos in short bursts than to have it seep constantly through the seams of everyday life. And so, flirtation was permitted, not officially, and certainly not encouraged, but quietly tolerated as long as it didn't end in scandal, which of course it often did. May Day was among the most notorious. It was a spring celebration tied to fertility, the renewal of the land, and an alarming number of symbolic sticks. In some regions, the maypole stood at the centre of village life, decorated with ribbons, surrounded by dancing, and used as a surprisingly effective visual aid for anyone trying to figure out who fancied whom. Participation was mandatory, particularly if you were young, unmarried, and in possession of functioning knees. The dances were repetitive, the music was cheerful, and the energy was unmistakably suggestive. Costumes played an important role. Masked revellers could interact in ways that would be frowned upon during normal hours. A stranger's hand on your waist during a dance could be dismissed as harmless festivity. A whispered compliment behind a flower garland might go unreported. The anonymity offered by masks was thin, of course. Most villagers could recognise one another by posture, smell, or general aura, but the pretense was enough. It gave everyone permission to flirt, or at least to pretend they were flirting with someone else. Alcohol flowed freely. This was both tradition and strategy. A well-lubricated crowd was more likely to sing, dance, and make terrible decisions. Ale, cider, and various fermented concoctions were consumed in staggering quantities, often alongside bread, meat, and whatever fruits hadn't yet rotted. Drunkenness was not only accepted, it was expected. Slurred declarations of affection, misdirected embraces, and extremely uncoordinated dancing were all part of the spectacle. And the next morning, so were the apologies, or in some cases, the quick arrangements for a wedding. Harvest festivals, similarly, were built on a foundation of exhaustion and relief. After weeks of grueling labour, villagers gathered to eat, drink, and momentarily forget that winter was coming. These events, usually held in autumn, were less overtly romantic than May Day, but equally permissive. They celebrated survival, abundance, and community. And what better way to express communal joy than by awkwardly trying to hold hands with the miller's niece under a table while pretending to reach for more cheese? Social roles blurred during festivals. Servants danced with their masters. Widows sang with young men. Children ran wild while their parents tried, for once, to remember what it felt like to laugh without consequence. For the lower classes, this loosening of hierarchy allowed for brief romantic crossings that would be impossible at any other time. A shepherd might flirt with a reeve's daughter. A scullery maid might share a drink with an apprentice smith. The moment wouldn't last, but while it did, it offered a glimpse of something freer. Taverns played a central role in this seasonal misrule. Normally rowdy at the best of times, they transformed into dens of celebratory chaos during feast days. Tables were pushed together, songs grew bawdier, and inhibitions melted like butter left too close to the hearth. Flirtation in the tavern was fast, clumsy, and usually incomprehensible. Eye contact was often replaced with exaggerated winks. Compliments became loud proclamations. If someone offered you a drink, it might be because they fancied you, admired your hat, or simply couldn't remember who they were supposed to be charming. Carnival in certain towns became an even stranger spectacle. This was especially true in regions influenced by pre-Lenten traditions, where the days before fasting were filled with indulgence, excess, and costume reversal. Men dressed as women, servants dressed as lords, and everyone acted just slightly more unhinged than usual. The point was to disrupt the usual structure, to mock authority, indulge desire, and cleanse the social palate through temporary anarchy. Flirtation during Carnival could be theatrical, ironic, or unintentionally sincere. One never quite knew whether the masked figure reciting poetry in a falsetto voice was serious, or just very drunk. These celebrations created space for what might otherwise be forbidden. Touching, laughing, noticing. They allowed people to experiment with affection, with very few safety nets. If you wore a mask and danced with a stranger at a feast, you might wake up married, or pregnant, or both. Occasionally, someone disappeared entirely, run off with a travelling troupe, a visiting merchant, or the vague idea of adventure. Their absence would be noted, gossiped about, and ultimately absorbed into the fabric of village life. After all, that's what feast days were for, rupture followed by return, but the consequences didn't always vanish with the decorations. Some flirtations sparked actual relationships, others sparked grudges, rivalries, or hastily arranged unions designed to prevent further embarrassment. A child born 9 months after a festival might carry with them a silent footnote. A couple who laughed too freely might find themselves under sudden pressure to announce bans. And someone who played the fool too well might find it difficult to return to their former dignity. The church watched all of this with a mixture of horror and strategic patience. Clerics often preached against excessive revelry, condemning drunkenness, lust, and inappropriate dancing in sermons delivered the week before the festival, knowing full well they would be ignored. Some parishes tried to limit the damage with early curfews, designated confession booths, or, in extreme cases, banning certain songs outright. One particularly panicked bishop attempted to outlaw all dancing in his diocese, only to be serenaded by a group of farmers with drums, jugs, and a pig painted gold. Still, for all the tension, the festivals served a purpose. They let off pressure. They gave the young something to look forward to, and the old something to remember. They were imperfect, chaotic, and occasionally scandalous, but they were also deeply human. In a world of strict roles, rigid expectations, and constant surveillance, these brief moments of sanctioned silliness allowed people to act on feelings that usually had no space to breathe. And perhaps most importantly, they allowed those who had never been good at words, glances, or carved wooden tokens a chance to simply be noticed. A quiet boy who never knew what to say might dance like a lunatic and earn a laugh. A shy girl might wear a ribbon in her hair and feel just for an evening like the heroine of a song. These were small victories, often forgotten by morning, but meaningful in their own time. Of course, not everyone enjoyed the festivals. For those with no prospects, no confidence, or no desire to participate, they could be alienating, even painful. Watching others flirt, stumble, and couple off while standing alone near the bread table was a kind of social torment. And for those already entangled in complicated relationships, the festivals could add more confusion than clarity. A misread signal, an unexpected encounter, or a drunken confession could unravel months of careful emotional management. But that too was part of the rhythm. Festivals were not tidy. They were not romantic in the modern sense. They were sweaty, unpredictable, and frequently ridiculous. They were built on masks, alcohol, and the hope that someone would look your way, even if they didn't remember your name. And when they ended, when the ribbons were taken down, the mugs washed, and the music faded, the old rules returned. The roles were reasserted. The flirtation was recategorized as a momentary lapse or a joke, or an unfortunate but ultimately forgivable mistake. Life resumed, but for a few strange, vivid days each year, it had been something else entirely. Once the garlands were pulled down and the hangovers had faded, the same grim arithmetic returned. Who was watching? Who was talking? And more importantly, who could afford to be seen? Because for all the silly songs and symbolic dances, flirtation in the medieval world was never neutral. It was judged, measured, and interpreted through a lens that rarely extended grace to those on the wrong side of power. And while men too faced risk in romantic pursuits, reputation, duels, unwanted marriage, the occasional dagger, it was women who bore the greater burden. A man might be foolish. A woman, by contrast, was always at risk of being considered dangerous. To flirt as a woman was to step into a field of traps. Smile too freely, and you were a harlot. Remain too silent, and you were a witch. Laugh too loudly, and you were drawing attention. Decline a compliment, and you were rude. Accept one, and you were clearly inviting something more. The ideal woman was, by all accounts, invisible and mute, unless she was being serenaded, married, or buried. All other forms of expression hovered somewhere between suspicion and sin. The importance of virginity cannot be overstated. A woman's honour in many communities was defined almost entirely by what she had not done. Chastity was currency, social protection, and an unwelcome inheritance passed from mother to daughter, along with advice about how not to walk too quickly past the smithy. It didn't matter whether the woman in question had flirted, reciprocated, or even understood what was happening. If her name was whispered alongside a man's for too long, her value could diminish overnight. Reputation moved fast in small communities. A glance noticed by the wrong person might become a rumour by sundown, and a confirmed scandal by market day. What actually occurred was often beside the point. The performance of innocence was what mattered. The correct posture, the quiet tone, the ability to pretend nothing was happening, even when it clearly was. It was not enough to be blameless. You had to look blameless, all the time, to everyone. Men, of course, were not held to the same standard. They were allowed to pursue, to tease, to joke. If they flirted clumsily, they were boys being boys. If they crossed boundaries, there was room for redemption, or at the very least a fine. But for women, there was rarely a second chance. A misstep could mean exclusion from the local marriage pool, social isolation, or, in more severe cases, being sent away entirely. A girl might be packed off to live with distant relatives for the crime of being too interesting to the wrong man. The legal system offered little in the way of protection. Consent as a concept was not always recognised in the way we understand it today. If a woman accused a man of inappropriate advances, she had to prove her own innocence before his guilt could even be considered. The assumption was often that she had invited the attention, or, if not invited, then certainly failed to prevent it. The burden rested on her shoulders, as did the consequences. This imbalance shaped how women navigated romantic interest. Many became experts in deflection, smiling politely, then moving away, pretending not to hear, inventing errands that needed urgent attention. Others relied on family members to run interference, a brother or aunt suddenly appearing just as a conversation grew too pointed. For some, silence became the safest response. The fewer words spoken, the fewer that could be misquoted. But silence did not guarantee safety. In some regions, being too quiet, too withdrawn, or too independent was its own form of danger. Women who did not marry young enough, who kept to themselves, or who refused suitors might find themselves labelled as odd, difficult, or, in extreme cases, unnatural. Accusations of witchcraft did not always stem from cauldrons or cats. Sometimes they began with a refusal to flirt back. Those who worked in public spaces, market vendors, barmaids, laundresses, faced constant negotiation. Their labour required interaction, and interaction required a kind of social performance that could be misread or deliberately twisted. A woman who laughed at a customer's joke might be accused of leading him on. One who ignored him might be called cruel or cold. It was a daily dance, not of courtship but of self-preservation, and it came with no music and no rest. Married women were not exempt from scrutiny. While technically off limits, they were often targets of attention, either because of their beauty, their status, or their perceived boredom. If a married woman responded to flirtation with anything less than immediate disdain, she risked more than her reputation. Adultery, real or imagined, could lead to legal penalties, corporal punishment, or public penance. In some communities, women found guilty of marital infidelity were paraded through the streets in shame garb, heads shaved, holding symbolic objects that advertised their supposed crime. Men, of course, rarely received such treatment. Flirtation between men and women of different classes introduced another layer of danger. A servant caught engaging with her master might be dismissed, beaten, or worse. Whether or not she had initiated the encounter was largely irrelevant. Power spoke louder than protest. Conversely, a noblewoman who found herself the object of interest from a lower-class man could see her entire household erupt in scandal, even if she had done nothing more than return a book with a smile. In some regions, customs arose to police behaviour more formally. Community surveillance became ritualised. In parts of Northern Europe, charivari parades mocked those suspected of improper relations, often loudly, sometimes violently. A couple suspected of inappropriate courtship might wake to find their home surrounded by villagers, banging pots, singing obscene songs, and dragging effigies through the streets. These events were often framed as moral correction, but they were also opportunities for collective judgment, veiled threats, and a public assertion of who belonged and who didn't. Even in cases where flirtation led to marriage, the process was rarely free of coercion. Women were expected to attract attention, but only from the right kind of man at the right time, with the right amount of subtlety. Once engaged, or betrothed, or vaguely assumed to be claimed, the pressure shifted. Now she must be obedient, modest, and grateful. Romantic interest, once dangerous, became compulsory. Cold feet were not permitted. Marriage was not a choice so much as a destination, and the route there was heavily patrolled. Still, many women found ways to assert themselves. Through coded language, shared glances, or carefully chosen gifts, they navigated the minefield with remarkable precision. Some used humour, others relied on reputation, cultivating an air of unattainability or religiosity that kept unwanted attention at bay. A few wielded their social power like a blade, capable of cutting down suitors with a single sentence. These strategies were not always successful, but they were deeply necessary. Flirtation for women was rarely about attraction. It was about survival. Of course, affection still bloomed. Couples still met, courted, and married, sometimes even for love. But those stories were quieter. They did not spread as easily as scandal. They did not involve shame parades or clerical outrage. They happened in gardens, over shared tasks, during long walks to fetch water, or hushed conversations on feast days. And even then, the risk never fully disappeared. Because for every successful courtship, there were others that ended in rumour, disgrace, or silence. In the end, flirtation in the medieval world was never just about two people. It was about their families, their communities, their reputations. It was about what others saw, what they chose to say, and what they refused to forget. For women especially, every choice was weighed against a backdrop of danger. Danger of being noticed, of being misjudged, of being blamed for something someone else had decided to feel. And yet, they tried. They laughed. They blushed. They sent tokens. They carved initials. They waited for someone to notice. Or they didn't. They avoided eye contact, wore plain clothing, moved silently through doorways, some hiding, some stood tall, some disappeared from records entirely. because if you smiled too freely, you were a harlot. If you didn't smile at all, you were a witch. And if you managed to do everything exactly right, you might still end up married to someone who didn't know how to flirt either. But at least then the judgment stopped. For a while. Flirtation in the medieval world was already a perilous act, especially for women who navigated its dangers under the weight of gossip, violence and reputation. But even if you did everything right, even if you timed your glances modestly and whispered your affections behind a hedgerow instead of in public view, there remained one obstacle larger than all the others. One presence that hovered over every interaction like a poorly ventilated incense cloud, the church. You could avoid jealous neighbours, you might dodge a disapproving uncle, but avoiding the church was impossible. It wasn't just a building at the centre of the village, it was the ideological scaffolding around which the entire culture had been built. It dictated not only when you confessed your sins, but what counted as sin in the first place. And in matters of love, it was unambiguous. Desire, unless properly married and oriented toward reproduction, was inherently suspect. Romantic affection was tolerated only insofar as it pointed, obediently, toward matrimony. Anything outside that narrow corridor, premature affection, misplaced glances, love across class lines, or, God forbid, attraction without intention, was a theological problem. And like all problems in medieval theology, it came with consequences. If your priest saw you holding hands, expect a sermon about eternal damnation and the lustful dangers of fingers. The Church's official stance on love was structured through canon law, the vast and often contradictory web of religious legal codes developed across centuries. These laws didn't just govern marriage, they governed intention. A promise of marriage, even an informal one, could be binding under canon law if it was accompanied by physical affection or witnessed by others. A flirtation that today might be dismissed as a moment of impulsive emotion could, in a medieval church court, be enough to justify forced union, penance, or excommunication. Sermons were the primary delivery method for moral correction. Local priests, many of whom knew their parishioners personally, delivered homilies tailored to the sins they suspected were occurring within earshot. Lust in all its many subcategories was a favourite topic. Lust of the eyes, lust of the body, lust of the imagination. Entire Sundays were dedicated to warning villagers about the spiritual consequences of flirtation, with examples specific enough to make everyone shift uncomfortably in their pews. Flirtation wasn't just discouraged, it was recast as a gateway to hell. A glance became the seed of corruption, a compliment, a prelude to damnation. Passion itself was portrayed as dangerous, not only for what it led to, but for what it revealed. An attachment to the world, to flesh, to the fleeting joys of human connection. In a theology that prized asceticism, even romantic joy was framed as a kind of spiritual treason. The confessional was no refuge. Though ostensibly a place of absolution, it was also a tool of surveillance. Parishioners were expected to confess not only their actions, but their thoughts, to admit attraction, to disclose fantasies, to name the person who had tempted them, even if that temptation was limited to a dream or an idle moment. Young people were frequently coached through these confessions with leading questions from priests who, under the seal of secrecy, were encouraged to pry deeply into the interior lives of their flocks. This made even harmless feelings feel tainted. A moment of affection might be followed by hours of guilt, days of silent prayer, or a week's worth of minor penance, fasting, extra prayers, or public acts of repentance designed to cleanse the soul of its imagined dirtiness. And while technically both men and women were subject to these spiritual obligations, the weight fell harder on women, whose virtue was constantly under moral audit. In some regions, church authorities went further. Local bishops issued edicts forbidding dances, unsupervised gatherings, or even particular styles of dress believed to provoke lust. The colour red was occasionally frowned upon. Tight sleeves were a subject of official complaint. A neckline that dipped slightly too low might be described in a sermon as a trap laid by Satan in linen. The line between modest flirtation and sinful display was thin, shifting, and policed by men who had neither romantic experience nor fabric knowledge. Ecclesiastical courts, when involved, brought a further layer of regulation. While not every flirtation became a legal matter, some did, especially when they resulted in disputed betrothals, broken promises, or scandalous consequences. A man who professed love to multiple women might be forced to marry one of them against his will. A woman accused of leading a man astray, even with no formal commitment, could find herself summoned to explain her behaviour. The court didn't need witnesses to an act. Rumour, suspicion, and indirect testimony were often enough. Church officials also monitored marriage arrangements closely. Marriages had to be announced in advance. The so-called bans read publicly 3 times in church to allow for objections. But even before this stage, any known flirtation could be scrutinised. A couple seen walking too closely, talking too often, or exchanging tokens might be assumed to be on the path to marriage, whether they intended it or not. This had legal implications. Breaking off a presumed courtship could lead to social retaliation or accusations of moral breach. In some cases, it led to trial. Clerical celibacy further complicated the dynamic. Parish priests, many of whom struggled with their own vows, were expected to enforce moral codes they often found personally difficult. The result was a strange blend of leniency and severity. Some turned a blind eye. Others cracked down on minor offences with disproportionate zeal. A priest who had once sinned himself might become aggressively moralistic, punishing others for the very same thoughts he was privately flagellating away in the rectory. Monasteries and convents, already addressed in an earlier section, were equally affected by the Church's obsession with purity. But even outside the cloister, the moral anxiety was thick. Love, especially youthful, unchaperoned love, was portrayed as reckless, destabilizing, and deeply inconvenient to the spiritual order. Those who felt it were advised to channel it upward. Romantic longing should be redirected toward Christ, the Virgin Mary, or the abstract ideal of spiritual union. There were saints who claimed to have been married to God. For everyone else, marriage was expected to be less about passion and more about duty. The language used in sermons reflected this. Passion was a fire that consumes the soul. Flirtation was the serpent's whisper. A woman's beauty was a snare for the righteous. A man's desire was a crack in his armour. These metaphors were designed not to inform, but to intimidate. They reframed human affection as a kind of spiritual ambush, a test one was destined to fail unless carefully armed with prayer, vigilance, and a healthy dose of fear. Some parishes employed public shaming rituals to reinforce these moral expectations. A couple caught kissing might be forced to sit at the front of the church for a month. A girl rumoured to have shown too much ankle could be assigned a special seat marked by its proximity to the font, as if repeated baptisms might rinse away suspicion. These punishments weren't codified in canon law. They were local traditions, supported by communal pressure and clerical approval, but they worked. Fear, as ever, was a powerful regulator, and yet people still flirted. They still fell in love. They still carved hearts into trees, passed folded notes, and made up excuses to borrow things from each other's families. They did so in secret, in silence, in defiance. They knew the risks, they understood the sermons, but the instinct to reach out remained stronger than the threat of retribution. And for some, that tension only made the experience more intense. To love under suspicion, to long under supervision, it made the smallest moments feel enormous. There were even those who sought spiritual loopholes. Couples promised themselves to each other in private troth ceremonies, sometimes with no witnesses and no priest. These unions were dangerous, technically valid under certain interpretations of canon law, but easy to deny or contest. Still, for those without parental approval or social standing, it was sometimes the only available option. A whispered vow, a symbolic ring, and a shared prayer might be the entirety of their wedding, and their only defence if challenged later. In rare moments, the church softened. A kind priest might look the other way. A bishop might issue a lenient ruling. Certain religious texts acknowledged that love, while dangerous, could also be beautiful. But these were exceptions, not the rule. For most of the medieval period, the church's relationship with courtship was defined by anxiety, repression, and the desire to keep desire under control. And so, for centuries, romance unfolded under a dome of disapproval. It bent itself around the pulpit, disguised itself in metaphors, and buried itself in confessionals. It adapted, as human feelings always do, but it never quite escaped. Because in the eyes of the church, love was not just an emotion, it was a threat, a crack in the order, a temptation toward autonomy, a risk that someone somewhere might choose affection over obedience. For all the church's warnings and the community's watchful eyes, flirtation persisted in medieval society. It adapted, morphed, and found crevices in which to breathe. But not all crevices were alike. Geography mattered. The space in which a glance was cast or a word was offered shaped everything that followed. There was a difference, subtle, structural, and significant, between flirting in a village where your grandmother knew everyone's sins and doing so in a city where anonymity, though fragile, allowed for something slightly bolder. The countryside was dense with familiarity. Even if you didn't know someone personally, you knew who their parents were, what their siblings had done during last year's harvest, and whether or not their uncle once tried to marry a girl from the next parish over, despite being already spoken for. Flirting in a village was not just a matter of attraction, it was a public act with consequences that rippled through entire families. A single comment could trigger gossip. A glance too long might lead to questions. A shared walk home could be mistaken for a courtship and treated accordingly. This meant that every gesture was measured. People flirted with their shoulders, with carefully timed pauses, with extra bread slipped into someone's bag at the market stall. Everything happened under the assumption that someone was watching, because someone always was. The hedgerow might hide you from sight, but not from suspicion. If you were seen talking too softly or laughing too loudly, a relative would hear about it before the sun went down. In many rural communities, marriage was as much a communal affair as a personal one. Potential matches were evaluated not only by their charm or competence, but by their family's reputation, their land holdings, and whether or not they were rumoured to have lice. Flirting too publicly with the wrong person might not just damage your own reputation, it could strain relations between households. It was not unusual for uncles, fathers, or older cousins to intervene in courtship before it began. If you flirted in the village, you risked your uncle overhearing and scheduling the wedding before you'd even finished blushing. That said, rural flirtation was not devoid of creativity. It simply required subtlety. Seasonal rhythms offered opportunities. Feast days, shared labour, communal gatherings, carrying firewood together, or gathering berries with a companion might become the medieval equivalent of a date. Church attendance, oddly enough, was also a space for cautious interaction. Seating arrangements, procession routes, and post-service lingering could be manipulated to bring people into proximity. If two individuals happened to be spotted walking home in the same direction after Mass, it could ignite an entire week of discussion. Rural communities were slow to forget. If you flirted once, successfully or not, it became part of your personal lore. It might be referenced in jokes years later, brought up during future proposals, or included in wedding toasts delivered by intoxicated neighbours. And should the courtship end badly, you could not escape it. The person you had once tried to impress might live 3 doors down from your in-laws for the rest of your life. In such an environment, restraint was often more important than boldness. It wasn't about making an impression, it was about not making the wrong one. In contrast, medieval cities offered something villagers rarely experienced: partial anonymity. Not total, of course. Guilds, parishes, and neighbourhoods still functioned as social containers, but the sheer number of people allowed for a little more breathing room. You could flirt in a city without everyone knowing your grandmother's name. You could admire someone from across a market square without your cousin poking you in the ribs. And if a flirtation failed, there was at least a chance you'd never see that person again. This created a different kind of social risk. In cities, the danger was not being caught by family, but being misunderstood, or worse, believed too quickly. A compliment might be mistaken for an offer. A smile could be construed as solicitation. The rapid churn of urban life meant that signals had to be both clearer and more cautious. There was less time for reputation to work on your behalf. You were often judged on your appearance, your tone, your clothing. And while this could work in your favour, it also meant missteps were easier to make. City flirtation leaned theatrical. There were more spaces in which to perform: public fountains, bustling streets, shop fronts, and taverns crammed with overheated apprentices. The urban environment encouraged banter, glances, and spontaneous interaction. Performers, vendors, and beggars all participated in the ongoing drama of city life, and romance often followed suit. A man might attempt to woo a woman by reciting poetry outside her window, even if that window belonged to someone else entirely, and the poem was stolen from a troubadour with a better memory. The presence of strangers also meant that flirting could occasionally be done without fear of consequence. Visitors, traders, and pilgrims came and went. A flirtation with someone passing through might offer excitement without entanglement, though just as often it led to complicated rumours, unwanted pregnancy, or the sudden appearance of an angry spouse with a very sharp dagger. Risk in the city was different, but it was always present. One advantage urban women held, at least those not under the direct control of noble households, was a slightly broader range of motion. Market vendors, artisans, and independent workers could encounter a wider array of potential suitors. A woman who sold bread might flirt with a clerk, a cooper, and a travelling musician in the same week, each encounter layered in ambiguity. Whether this was empowering or exhausting depended heavily on the woman's social position, her family's tolerance, and the quality of the clerk's conversation. Cities also offered physical spaces for flirtation that did not exist in most villages. Taverns, bathhouses, guild halls, and even certain public gardens became unofficial stages for romantic interaction. Some were more respectable than others. A flirtation over shared wine in a guild banquet might lead to courtship. A flirtation in a bathhouse might lead to public penance. The location mattered, as did the time of day, the number of witnesses, and whether or not you were in the same parish as your confessor. In urban parishes, priests still preached against lust and loose behaviour, but they did so to larger, more varied audiences. Enforcement was less personal and sometimes less consistent. A particularly flirtatious exchange in one district might go unnoticed, while in another, it could land you in front of a church court with a pile of contradictory witness statements. The anonymity that protected you also isolated you. There were fewer buffers, fewer advocates, and fewer second chances. Of course, cities had their own informal enforcement mechanisms. Chief among them, gossip. Just because there were more people didn't mean people talked less. Neighbourhoods, tenements, and communal wells were fertile ground for rumour. A mismatched couple, a servant seen leaving a merchant's home too early, a sudden engagement between a baker's daughter and a visiting tailor. All of these sparked discussion, but the nature of the city meant that scandal often passed more quickly. Today's shame was tomorrow's footnote. For men, city flirtation offered opportunity and illusion in equal measure. A young man might reinvent himself in a city, pretend to have more money, more status, more wit than he actually possessed. If he failed, he could try again with someone else. If he succeeded, he might discover too late that the woman he courted had 3 brothers and a business license. Flexibility, for better or worse, went both ways. Class played a more visible role in urban settings. Nobles, merchants, apprentices, and servants all brushed against each other in marketplaces and alleyways, but their flirtations were rarely treated the same. A nobleman flirting with a servant might be considered charming, or predatory, depending on the outcome. A servant flirting with a noble's daughter was almost always dangerous. In theory, cities allowed for more freedom. In practice, the old rules still applied, just with better cobblestones. Rural and urban flirtation were shaped by different pressures, but they shared the same core anxieties. The risk of being seen, the risk of being misread, and the ever-present possibility that what began as a glance might end as a lifetime commitment or a court appearance. In the village, you flirted slowly, cautiously, with an eye on your neighbour's hedge. In the city, you flirted quickly, dramatically, with one hand on your coin purse and the other near the exit. Both had their charm, both had their dangers, and both, in their own awkward, heavily monitored way, were proof that no amount of surveillance, clerical, communal, or architectural, could quite eliminate the human need to be noticed. Whether it took place in a cramped village alleyway or beneath the shadow of a cathedral, flirting in the medieval world was a delicate, often doomed exercise in timing, subtlety, and guesswork. If you played your cards right, you might secure a spouse, a warm moment of companionship, or, at the very least, a tolerable reputation. But if you played them wrong, even by accident, the outcome could be far more dramatic. Because in a society where affection was regulated by custom, religion, and collective surveillance, there was very little room for error. Misread signals, unreciprocated attention, or even just bad luck could turn an innocent exchange into a public scandal. If you winked at the wrong man's daughter, you might find yourself married before dinner, or dead before sunrise. And that wasn't a metaphor. There were cases in which flirtation, or the perception of flirtation, resulted in bloodshed. A young man making eyes at a girl promised to another might find himself chased out of town, horseless and bruised, with a family feud trailing behind him like a badly knotted cloak. In many cases, the damage began not with an action, but with a rumour. Medieval communities ran on gossip, and gossip moved faster than carts. A girl seen speaking privately with a boy in the churchyard might be described as promised, before either party even discussed the possibility. A boy who gave a flower to the wrong baker's daughter might find himself on the receiving end of marriage negotiations, complete with witnesses who swore they heard a proposal that never left his mouth. The idea of pre-contract played a particularly confusing and dangerous role in these situations. Under canon law, a verbal promise to marry, if witnessed or accompanied by gestures of affection, could be treated as legally binding. This meant that a careless phrase or even a flirtatious joke could be interpreted as a formal betrothal, and once such a promise was made, breaking it was not only socially risky, but spiritually costly. Failing to honour a pre-contract could lead to church court, community punishment, or in some cases, public acts of penance involving bare feet and solemn processions. Forced marriage was one of the more common consequences of flirtation gone awry. If a couple was caught kissing, embracing, or even walking together too often, parents or elders might pressure them into immediate union, sometimes out of moral panic, sometimes for the sake of appearances. In rural areas, this could happen with alarming speed. A simple act of flirtation in the morning might be resolved with a priest and a dowry discussion by sundown. Consent in these cases was often assumed or ignored entirely. Of course, not all consequences involved matrimony. Sometimes the response was physical. Men who flirted too brazenly, especially with women outside their class or station, risked beatings, duels, or worse. An apprentice who dallied with the daughter of a guildmaster might find himself stripped of his position and escorted out of the city by a group of men who'd had just enough ale to be thorough. Punishment didn't always come from authority. It came from fathers, brothers, cousins, and friends with strong opinions and even stronger arms. In urban areas, legal responses were more formalised. Ecclesiastical courts handled cases of seduction, false promises, and inappropriate behaviour. While these courts rarely issued capital punishment, they could enforce public shame rituals, monetary fines, or periods of enforced separation. In some cities, a man found guilty of dishonouring a woman might be required to stand barefoot before the cathedral and admit his offence aloud. These rituals were not just humiliating, they were public theatre designed to reinforce moral boundaries through spectacle. Women, as usual, bore the heavier consequences. If a woman was perceived as overly flirtatious, even without concrete action, she could be labelled as promiscuous. This label could follow her for years, limiting her chances of marriage, employment, or social mobility. In some communities, women suspected of seduction, whether fairly or not, might be excluded from communal gatherings, marked by ridicule, or subjected to symbolic punishments. A garland of nettles, a seat apart from others at church, a sudden silence when she entered the room. In extreme cases, shame crossed over into exile. A scandal that could not be contained sometimes resulted in someone being sent away, not always as punishment, but as a means of restoring peace. A young woman accused of leading men astray might be sent to relatives in another town, which was medieval shorthand for hidden until the fuss dies down. A young man whose attentions resulted in pregnancy without marriage and might be ordered to leave until such time as he could afford to marry, or at least afford to leave again more quietly. And then there was the matter of violence, not the informal violence of angry relatives, but the formalised violence of state punishment. In cases where flirtation tipped into actual assault, the penalties were severe, on paper at least. A man who forcibly compromised a woman's virtue could, depending on local laws and social status, be punished with fines, mutilation, or execution. In practice, however, outcomes were inconsistent. Wealth, reputation, and the willingness of witnesses to speak made all the difference. A powerful man might face little more than a warning. A poor man might hang. For women, the consequences of non-consensual encounters were paradoxical. She might be pitied, or she might be blamed. If she became pregnant, her options narrowed dramatically. She might be married off to her assailant as a twisted form of restoration. She might be sent to a convent, though this often required a dowry. She might be forced to confess in church and ask for forgiveness, publicly, even if she had done nothing wrong. The medieval world lacked a concept of victimhood divorced from shame. Flirtation between classes created additional hazards. A nobleman seen with a servant girl might raise eyebrows. A servant seen with a noblewoman might lose more than his job. Class boundaries were enforced not only by law, but by cultural expectation. Crossing those lines could lead to mockery, punishment, or a reputation so thoroughly stained that no future flirtation was possible. It wasn't just the act that caused trouble. It was who you acted with and who saw it. Even same-sex flirtation, rare as it appears in official records, carried severe risk. While historical evidence is limited and often deliberately obscured, we know that expressions of affection between people of the same gender, if interpreted as romantic, could be punished under sodomy laws, church edicts, or local custom. Whether or not the feeling was mutual, even the perception of such a relationship could lead to excommunication, imprisonment, or worse. In some places, suspicion alone was enough to ruin a life. Not all misfires ended in tragedy. Sometimes flirting simply failed. A token was returned. A letter went unread. A glance was met with confusion. These minor rejections might sting, but they rarely escalated, unless, of course, the rejected party insisted on making it worse. Stalking, persistence, and public embarrassment were not new inventions. A man who refused to take no for an answer might become a pariah or a joke, or a cautionary tale whispered to daughters with unflattering adjectives attached. There were even cases of revenge. A woman insulted by a man's unwanted advances might retaliate with gossip, strategic flirtation with his rivals, or symbolic acts of rejection. In some parts of Europe, women engaged in public mockery rituals to humiliate men who had wronged them, singing rude songs, staging comic performances, or dragging effigies through the streets. These acts were both entertainment and justice, a way of restoring balance through laughter and public shaming. Flirtation also failed when sincerity clashed with reputation. A man genuinely interested in a woman might find that her family dismissed him because of past behaviour. A woman might decline a kind suitor because her community wouldn't approve of his station, or because she'd once heard a rumour about his sister and a travelling friar. In a world without privacy, the past never quite stayed buried, and love, even when well-intentioned, couldn't always overcome the weight of collective memory. All of this made flirtation a high-stakes game. The risks were social, legal, physical, and emotional. A single gesture, worded poorly or received badly, could derail a reputation. A smile might lead to partnership or to penance. There were few guarantees and many consequences, some disproportionate, some absurd, all real. And yet people kept trying, because for every ruined reputation, there was a love match. For every awkward misunderstanding, a fond memory. For every exile, a reunion. For every sermon about lust, a moment of laughter in the market, a flower pressed into a palm, a heart scratched into a doorframe. Because no matter how many ways it could go wrong, the desire to connect, to be seen, to be wanted, to be chosen, remained stronger than the fear of getting it wrong. Of all the forms medieval flirtation could take, public glances, shared bread, carved spoons, whispered riddles, drunken dances, questionable potions, none were as dramatic, as tortured, or as hopelessly overwritten as the medieval love letter. If earlier forms of courtship were clumsy physical gestures, the love letter was a full literary performance. It was not merely a note slipped across a pew or tucked beneath a door. It was a declaration of spiritual torment, penned in quill and desperation, intended to convince its recipient that nothing short of divine union, or at the very least, a prolonged glance, might relieve the suffering of the author. The love letter was often the last refuge of those too shy to speak aloud, too distant to interact directly, or too idealistic to consider the logistics of a real relationship. Nobles wrote them from castle balconies. Clerks drafted them between inventory ledgers. Monks, against all better judgment, sometimes composed them as theological treatises. And like all things involving ink and unrequited longing, the results were often catastrophic. Sentences looped endlessly through metaphor and abstraction, thick with references to Greek mythology, Christian martyrdom, and the occasional garden vegetable. Grammar was optional. Clarity was forbidden. And the deeper the affection, the more unreadable the letter became. At the core of the medieval love letter was the belief that love was a form of divine suffering, a purgatory to be endured, not resolved. The more pain you could communicate, the more sincere your affection appeared. Saying "I love you" plainly would be laughably insufficient. Instead, one might write, "Your eyes are twin stars brighter than any lamp in Christendom, piercing the veil of my soul's despair with every cruel blink." If that sounds unhinged, congratulations. That means it was authentic. Medieval love didn't believe in subtlety. It believed in torment. Letters were often modelled after the courtly love tradition, which prioritised poetic longing over physical outcome. You were expected to pine, not possess, to suffer nobly, not seduce successfully. This meant that entire letters might focus on the moral superiority of the beloved, her purity, her wisdom, her unreachable stature, rather than anything so crass as an actual date. To gaze upon thy countenance is to feel both joy and terror, as a pilgrim before a relic too sacred to touch, wrote one 14th century scribe to a woman who, reportedly, worked in a bakery and had never spoken to him. In terms of structure, a love letter typically opened with a lamentation. This was the emotional groundwork. You were dying, you were fading, you had not eaten or slept in 3 days, all because of the unbearable agony of not knowing whether she noticed you that one time outside the church door. This might be followed by a list of compliments, each more baroque than the last. Her hair was silkier than Marian veils. Her fingers made harpists weep. Her walk defied the laws of gravity. If the author knew anything about her personality, that might be included, though it was more common to base the entire letter on the impression of having glimpsed her profile through a window. Next came the metaphors. These were the true danger zone. Many love letters fell into lexical disaster at this point, comparing their beloved's attributes to animals, weather patterns, celestial events, or obscure biblical scenes. One 15th century letter describes the recipient's laugh as a choir of angels being tickled by the Holy Spirit. Another describes the agony of waiting as akin to being roasted slowly on the griddle of lust. Still another compares the beloved's voice to the soft moan of a dying deer, which, while technically poetic, was probably not as flattering as intended. After metaphor came supplication. This was where the writer begged, tastefully of course, for some kind of acknowledgement. Not necessarily love returned, but perhaps a nod, a smile, a token, something to sustain the poor soul through the next week of existential yearning. Should you see fit to grant me a glance, even one, my joy would overflow the bounds of this mortal vessel and spill unto the cobblestones of our blessed town, wrote one especially overwrought apprentice. Responses, if they came at all, were usually brief. Please do not send me any more verses about my elbows. Interestingly, many love letters were never sent. They were exercises in catharsis, written, wept over, folded into tokens or tucked into prayer books, and left to yellow in silence. This was especially true in monasteries and among women, where the social or spiritual cost of sending a letter could be catastrophic. For them, writing love letters was a private rebellion, a hidden indulgence, a way to shape feelings that could not be spoken. Some scholars have found layers of emotional expression buried beneath safe-seeming metaphor. A sister of the cloth writing to her spiritual companion about their shared devotion to the Virgin, while quietly referencing shared nights and secret smiles. Others find awkward evidence of failed metaphors hastily crossed out. Your eyes like warm lentils, no. For men, especially noble or literate ones, the love letter could also serve a political or economic function. A beautifully written letter might persuade a father to consider a match. It might demonstrate piety, wit, or education, all useful in negotiations where romance was deeply entangled with property and lineage. In some cases, love letters were collaborative efforts. A young knight might commission a more literate scribe to compose something sufficiently poetic. This led to entire industries of letter-writing guides and sample phrases, the medieval equivalent of Googling romantic texts that don't sound desperate. These guides offered phrases you could borrow, alter, or outright plagiarize. I am consumed as a candle in the chapel, weeping wax in your name. Without your love, I am but a falcon with clipped wings, gazing skyward. I long to pluck the rose of your virtue without offending the gardener of your modesty. Some letters strayed from metaphor entirely and simply became lists of emotional symptoms. I sweat, I shake, my knees buckle, I cannot eat soup without thinking of your ankles. The line between poetry and medical complaint was often perilously thin. And then there were the letters that tried too hard, the ones that referenced every classical virtue, every saint, every tragic figure in history, and still managed to say absolutely nothing. These were the linguistic tragedies, the ones that opened with Cicero and ended in emotional gibberish. As Helen was to Troy, so art thou to mine entrails. Yea, even my liver doth quiver in thy sight. No one knew what it meant, least of all the person receiving it, but it sounded heartfelt, and sometimes that was enough. Some recipients cherished their letters, folded them into ribbons, or kept them beneath pillows. Others mocked them publicly, reading them aloud in marketplaces, or posting them as cautionary tales. The social risk of sending a love letter was real. If your passion was returned, you were a romantic. If it wasn't, you were a laughingstock. And in rare cases, you were arrested, particularly if your letter was seen as obscene, or if you were of the wrong class or the wrong sex, or simply too persistent. It's worth noting that not all letters were poetic. Some were transactional. A butcher might write to a widow offering both affection and a stable source of meat. A farmer might propose shared tenancy as a sign of devotion. These were less flowery, but more effective. My barn is dry and I have no debts could be a more compelling argument than thy eyes are like lambent pools, especially if you had a goat to sweeten the deal. In all cases, the medieval love letter was a gamble, an act of vulnerability in a world where emotion was rarely private. It was an attempt to shape affection into language, even when the language itself was unwieldy, unhelpful, or slightly unhinged. And though many were never answered, they left a paper trail of longing through the centuries, scraps of parchment that remind us just how constant and just how ridiculous love has always been. So if you were a young scribe or a merchant's daughter, or a knight with more ambition than sense. You might one day find yourself hunched over a borrowed table, ink-stained fingers shaking slightly, pouring your soul into a metaphor about her nose. You would finish the letter, seal it with wax, and tuck it into your sleeve, hopeful that it might reach her hand, and terrified that it would. And if she wrote back, well, that would be the start of an entirely different disaster. Romance, as we've seen, was never easy. Not in the cloisters, not in the taverns, not beneath the hedgerows or behind the altar. Whether you were a peasant with mud on your boots or a noble with silk in your sleeves, the experience of medieval flirtation was rarely smooth and never safe. It was a strange, uncomfortable blend of longing and logistics, of metaphor and livestock, where desire had to be disguised, chaperoned, confessed, or carved into wood. And even then, it usually went horribly wrong. We like to imagine that love in the Middle Ages was grand, that troubadours strummed delicate ballads, while maidens swooned from balconies and men duelled honourably for a lady's hand. But that fantasy forgets the chafing shoes, the legal contracts, the lice, the sermons, and the neighbours who watched your every move while loudly speculating on your dowry. In reality, romance was far more transactional, more public, and more uncomfortable than any fairy tale suggests. There were no apps, but there were goats, no texting, but plenty of gossip, and the risk of embarrassment or social ruin lurked around every badly timed compliment. A flirtatious glance might earn a slap or a sermon. A gift might be mistaken for a business proposal. A love letter could end up in the hands of a priest, a parent, or a very bored village scribe who read it aloud to his friends. There were customs to follow, but no real rules. Just a shifting mess of expectations shaped by class, gender, geography, and whatever the church happened to condemn that year. In many ways, love was a performance, a game of appearances. You had to signal interest without looking eager, express affection without sounding sinful, and somehow convince another human being that spending the rest of their life tethered to your family's grain yield was a good idea. And yet, despite all this, despite the misread signals and the poorly chosen metaphors, and the sudden moral panic over dancing too close on May Day, people still fell in love, or something close to it. They pined, they hoped, they stitched favours into sleeves and waited for answers that never came. They sang songs under windows, they carved initials into tree bark, they whispered vows into haylofts, and invented new sins to confess by candlelight. Most of them were not poets, many were not particularly attractive, but they tried, and that's the most human thing of all. And that brings us to the end of tonight's slow stumble through medieval flirtation, a world of longing glances, incomprehensible poetry, and social peril disguised as romance. If you enjoyed this awkward little wade through the muddy trenches of historical courtship, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another strange corner of history you'd like to see explored. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.